Hello survivors and welcome to First Aid Spray, a Resident Evil podcast by fans for fans. This is episode 83 where we concoct our own viruses and make our own outbreaks as we sit down and discuss the world of classic Resident Evil modding. My name is Sai and joining me on the panel this week, if he was a mod he'd be the only one you need to install to make a great Resident Evil podcast. It's Fire Button Steve Valance.
Citation needed. Hello everybody.
The first of our guests for this episode has an impressive architectural resume. He's worked on the RPD, the SS Starlight, and as one of the first members of the First Aid Spray Discord server, it's Colin, aka ALSOP.
Oh my god.
And our other guest is so prolific in the Resident Evil fan game community that you could never put him under Resident Evil containment. It's Aydan Watkins.
Hello everyone, and I like the pun.
You're welcome. First Aid Spray is recorded in front of a live Discord server audience, so join now to hear the show early and unedited and to become part of our wonderful little community where we discuss life, the universe, and Resident Evil. You can find the server and all of our social media links at our website, faspraypod.com. That's where you can find our merchandise store and our Patreon page. First Aid Spray is nothing without our supporters. Tiers begin at just $1 a month with a host of benefits. Head over to patreon.com/faspraypod to support the show. Shout out to our latest Patreon supporter, Dante_101. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our patrons who have access right now, early access, of course, to the Resident Evil 4 episode of Not Recommended, which, as a reminder, is the show where James and a guest, in this case Steve, go over the negative reviews of Resident Evil games and trying to come up with various rebuttals. That will be going to the public in due course, and we have other episodes of that show in the pipeline as well. That's everything from us. Steve, would you like to take us into the Resident Evil news?
Now, as we know, it's a very intense political year with elections and the like, but the most important one, the Capcom Super Election, has taken place, with interesting Resident Evil and survival horror results.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at this, it's pretty clear that Western social media in particular had a point to prove, let's put it that way. Standouts, lots from Dino Crisis. Let's get that out of the way. That's the most important one here. One of the questions, which were the following Capcom games do you like the best? Devil May Cry 5 came out on top. Dino Crisis came out second, beating out Resident Evil 4 Remake. There was also a question of which franchise you'd like to see return. Dino Crisis didn't make the top 10 in Japan, but it was right up there for the world, and it appears repeatedly throughout, and there are some Resident Evil ones as well. You know, who's your favourite Capcom male character and female character? Leon and Jill were up there and that kind of thing. So yeah, it had a good showing for Resident Evil. I think the big news is Resident Evil adjacent, and we have covered Dino Crisis on the show before, so I thought it was worth talking about as a bit of a sister series to Resident Evil. Steve, what was your reaction to this stuff? Because it bounced around social media for a few days, so people are now maybe hopeful that something might happen because Capcom have almost been forced to acknowledge the fan demand.
I think it's a good step in the right direction, although I wonder how much of it is just Joe Muncher on Twitter going, please vote for Dino Crisis. Genuinely speaking, though, I mean, outside of Tekken, the last time we saw any official Dino Crisis stuff was literally a costume in a Dead Rising spin-off. So we're overdue. We are overdue a reappearance of Regina. Maybe not Dylan, he's kind of boring, but, you know, Regina certainly. I think she's like the poster girl for the franchise. I'm all for it, really. Dinosaurs are slowly becoming more in, and you know I'm going to just look at the other half of the panel tonight and go, if you can do any like indie Resident Evil Dino Crisis mashups, I'd be more than happy to go. Yes, please.
Yeah, definitely, and it's really interesting because they have like breakdown of age brackets for votes as well. And, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but there was a lot of, like, people in their 20s that were voting for Dino Crisis, and it's like, the series was dead before you were born, so, I mean, I don't know if you're getting swept up in the social media hype, or maybe you actually are. I've gone back and played these and enjoyed these games, which is great. I'm happy either way. I just thought it was very interesting. Colin, what's your reaction to this, and are you looking for more Dino Crisis in your life?
Anything that isn't a remake of a remake, I'll be happy with, so yes, I will take more Dino Crisis.
But does that include a remake, though, I guess is the question. Is that how you kick things off?
Well, at least it's not a remake of...
Yeah.
At least it's not like a remake of the remake of Resident Evil 1, which it doesn't need. It's just going to be a remake of the original, which does need a remake, because if I have to go through DDKs anymore, Or any of them puzzles. No thanks.
Completely fair. Completely fair. Aydan, how do you feel about the Dino Crisis love-in right now? Are you hopeful?
Yeah. I mean, I really like the series. I'm with Colin though. Like the DTKs are fine, but like some of those puzzles later in the labs and like in the underground, like reactor places, yeah. All if they can like streamline that kind of stuff, make it a little bit more action packed, like RE4 remake with dinosaurs, I'm sold.
I think
Everyone's looking at Rick and saying, yes, that's a very well thought out plan, but Gale says shoot things, and that's a lot easier.
I think it's...
Thank you.
We've talked about it when we covered it. Like, it is a game that's quite flawed and doesn't quite meet its full potential, maybe. So I think a remake treatment would be great for it. And obviously, and I've said many times over, what even really is Dino Crisis? Like, how do you make a Dino Crisis 4? Because Dino Crisis to me is not necessarily the same as it is to everyone else, because my favourite one is Dino Crisis 2, which is this crazy action arcade game. And I know lots of people appreciate the more survival horror based one over that. And of course, there's the game that doesn't exist as well. So there's lots of different directions that Dino Crisis has gone. So where they would go with a new game is up for debate. So maybe the important thing is just to set a new groundwork by doing a remake. The Resident Evil remakes are huge. Capcom are going to keep remaking games because it's profitable. So we've all said, yeah, Dino Crisis remake, that seems to be the most likely thing to come out of this, if indeed something does come out of this.
Next news story, Hold the Phone, RE7 and Remake 2 are finally coming to Mac and iPhone.
How exciting. Yeah, just throwing it in there, I guess. The continual Resident Evil gets ported to everything ever. We had some of this with Village and RE4 are recently being ported to mobiles and stuff like that. And yeah, it's fine, I guess. I can't imagine that playing these games on iPhone is the ideal way to play these games, but I guess it's cool that they're out there. Anybody got any opinions on this?
When we're living in a society where game stores are now being shut down, physically and not so physically, like, you know, the actual game stores in the UK and then the Xbox 360 online store, I'll take them putting their games on more storefronts. It's ridiculous, and I'm sure it's not the best quality of a port. At least it's more availability, which in the end means more preservation. I bet it runs like, 480p or something. It won't be pretty. It'll be streamed, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I imagine it's cloud based. I've not looked into it because personally, I don't care. I don't own either of those things anyway. But it means nothing to me. But you have to imagine they're going to be cloud based games because they are chunky. Cool. Well, it's nice to have Resident Evil news for a change, but that is it. So we're going to get into the main subject of this episode, which is the world of Resident Evil fan games. And now, reading the file Watchman's Diary from Resident Evil 2 1998, Axel Gear, who you can follow on Twitter at AxelGear11.
August 11th. I finally had the chance to see blue skies for the first time in ages, but it did little to lift my spirits. I was reprimanded by the chief for neglecting my duties while I was up in the clock tower. There's only one thing I still don't understand. The chief seemed to be more concerned about the fact that I was up on the tower rather than that I was neglecting my duties. Why was access to the tower prohibited in the first place, anyway? September 5th. I recently talked to the old man who works in the scrapyard out back. His name is Thomas. He's a quiet man and really seems to enjoy chess. He even went so far as to design a special key and a lock engraved with chess pieces on them for one of the doors in the disposal yard. We made plans to play chess tomorrow night. I can't help but wonder how good he is. But one thing that's been bothering me about him is the way he's always scratching himself. Does he have some sort of skin disease, or is he just rude? September 9th. Thomas was a much better player than I imagined. I used to think of myself as a fairly decent player, but he did a pretty good job of humbling me. About the only thing I imagine that could match his skills in chess is his appetite. All the guy did was talk about food through the entire game. He sounded fairly healthy, but he didn't look quite right. I wonder if he's okay. September 12th. I was supposed to play another game of chess with Thomas, but we had to cancel because he hasn't been feeling too well. He stopped by to see me, but I told him to go back and rest since he literally looked like The Walking Dead. He insisted that he was just fine, but I could tell he was really having problems. Come to think of it, I haven't been feeling too good myself lately.
So we've always prided ourselves in First Aid Spray here being a bit of a community-driven show. Just heard a file reading, for example. It's always been something for us, and we like bringing in guests like we have today. And we like to talk about various different aspects of the community, which we probably don't do enough, and I'm happy to do it again today. We talked about speedrunning a couple of years ago, and this episode comes from that same pocket. We want to talk about something very specific that's maybe feels very niche if you were to look at Resident Evil from a more casual perspective, but if you are deep in the fandom, and if you want to call it that, then you know that Resident Evil has a long history with modding and fan games, which is why we have brought onto this podcast two people who know a hell of a lot more about it than Steve and I do, who know very little about it, actually. So this is an opportunity for us to learn more about the process and the history of Resident Evil and fan games. But yes, welcome to the show, Aydan and Colin. I'm going to start off with the more broad question I ask every guest that we have on the show. How did you get into Resident Evil? You know, what was your first experience with it? Why did you fall in love with Resident Evil to quite the extent that both of you must have done to devote so much time to creating the art that you have over the last year, however many years it's been for you individually? But yes, how did you get into Resident Evil? Aydan, let's start with you. What was your first experience?
Okay, so my first experience and exposure to Resident Evil was back in 1997. My mother bought a Sega Saturn, and she had a copy of Resident Evil and played through it. I was quite young at the time, but I fell in love with it and decided to play it myself, despite being underage. And I fell in love with like the locations, the lore, the story, the gameplay. Just I was completely hooked and immersed from day one. So yeah, I've literally been a fan since '97.
I love that. Like, whenever a story starts with Sega Saturn version, I'm like, I just love that little ring. And exactly what you just said, Steve, during the news, we might poo-poo the iPhone version, but however, in 20 years' time, there'll be people being like, my first game was Resident Evil 7 on the iPhone. So, I mean, that's the beauty of all the weird, wonderful ports of Resident Evil.
But are the ticks in it, Si?
Was that the ticks? Exactly.
Are there ticks in it? That's what will make it.
That's right. Colin, how did you get into Resident Evil?
That is a good question.
Can you remember?
Yes, I can. Don't know what year it was, though, but I remember it being, I was ill. My mum rented the second game. So I started playing it. I was young myself at the time. Died right at the very start of the game as Leon. And I hated the game from that point onwards. It wasn't until I hit 14 and I watched the original Dawn of the Dead that I started to appreciate zombies as a genre. So I kind of went back, played the game myself in one sitting. 6 hours later, 26 saves later, I fell in love with the series from that point onwards. And then went back to 1, went to 3, carried on playing them ever since.
Your trajectory sounds so familiar to me, because I had exactly the same thing, where it was like I bounced right off of it at first because I just couldn't get through the first few rooms. As many people, if you started with RE2, it was very common. So yes, sitting here smiling, thinking about that, definitely. Okay, so my next question then pertains to the subject at hand, is how did you first become aware of modding of video games and fan games as a concept? Not necessarily Resident Evil specific, but do you remember what your first memories were of, you can use the guts of a video game, swap them around, create something new from something, again, speaking from someone with experience, but something as, quote, simple as changing a skin or whatever to full conversions into a brand new game. Aydan, what was your first experience or exposure to the video game modding scene?
If I'm honest, I'm not sure about. I'm probably going to say early 2000s, literally 2000, 2001. when I first got a computer and like the internet started becoming pretty normal in homes in Britain and stuff. But obviously everyone knows about Doom with mods and all there. But I think mine was more like NES ROM hacks and things like that. So like that kind of introduced me to the concept of it, so to speak. But yeah, so Doom, Duke Nukem 3D, and just random NES hacks from the early 2000s.
Were you sort of creatively minded already? Did it just like speak to you, like you like to create stuff, or was it just the fact that you were a video game fan and it was just interesting and weird?
At the time, it was more just a video game fan. I've always dabbled in like little engines and things like back in the day. Back then, I messed around with RPG Maker and things like that. But diving into the world of modding was not something I had really any interest in back then.
It's funny enough, actually, because like, as we talk about this, I'm like, oh yeah, Doom, loads of fan mods, and RPG Maker, another one. That's the closest I've ever gotten. Like, I've put hours into RPG Maker, just the building blocks of the beginning of a game, and never getting really anywhere with it. But that's the closest I've gotten. So that's really interesting to hear you mention that. Colin, what was your first exposure to the modding scene in video games?
Gotta be Doom,
Oh, yes.
Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem. But then, of course, stuff like, again, RPG Maker gets mentioned. And, of course, Resident Evil, when there was the early stages of modding, because I couldn't even think or fathom back then that they could actually be modded until I started modding them. And then it all went off from there.
Do you remember, and this might be a tough question because it casts your mind way back, but like, either of you really, but Colin, do you remember what the first Resident Evil mods and stuff that you saw, like early internet days, what kind of stuff it was?
Early stuff we're talking was Milkshake 3D, so it was just adjusting vertices to make the model different because there wasn't a way to export and import the data like there is now. And I keep mentioning, well, someone's going to mention Requiem of Spies at some point because that was like the first mod that everybody can think of.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I take that's like a full conversion thing, is it?
Well, Requiem of Spies was the first mod that Enrico did. I mean, he was like the main modder that everybody knows now, and he's on doing several projects at the moment. I am working with him on Project Starlight, and he voiced every character in the game because it was basically it's a story about Rebecca being Raccoon, and he actually voiced Rebecca, every other character that was encountered. And it did get a part into Classic Rebirth, and I'm pretty sure Aydan was the one that actually did that.
That's cool.
Yeah, it is absolutely hilarious. Like, don't get me wrong, I ported it over with Andrew's permission for for preservation, because despite its hilarity and how dated it is, it's still one of the first ever examples of like deep level modding for RE2. So, yeah.
That's good. Again, coming back to what we were saying in the news, it's preservation of history is what it is. Like, sure, you could change it up and modernize it today if you wanted to, but it's important also to know where it all came from. It sounds like a linchpin of the Resident Evil, community in that aspect as well. That's cool then. So these are the kind of things that were inspirations on you. So Colin, you said you dove into the Resident Evil community after seeing that kind of thing. How did you get started in terms of modding? What are your early modding experiences for yourself? Like, how long did it take you to pick this kind of thing up?
So I had to check this. I had to go and research how long it was before I registered back in the day. So originally there was no actual forum for it. I mean, there was Project Safehouse, which was, again, the starting points of modding. But before I actually started getting to it, that had disappeared. And the only thing that exists now is the manuals that were wrote, which was like the early days of understanding file structure, how textures work, everything like that. And eventually, Megan Grass and Enrico were doing like forum threads in The Horror is Alive. That's back in the day. And eventually, it became the first Envision Free forum, and that's when I registered in 2008 because I was interested in like how people reverse engineering stuff, creating new content. And the very first thing I remember doing was I actually created a zombie Leon skin for one of the enemies in the game, but that was doing it in the old way. So that's ripping things into clots, getting the index colours to work, and then hoping to God the engine would actually accept it, because half the time it wouldn't.
Interesting. That makes sense as a starting point as well. Aydan, what was your sort of earliest Resident Evil modding products?
Okay, so I started way later. I actually didn't start modding until about mid-2019. So,
oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the thing. So for me, the scene was very different because I know when Colin was around back in like the early early 2000s, early 2010s, there were like forums and there was a lot of discussion and a lot of community. But when I came along in 2019, they were only like basically what was left of the forums was kind of like graveyards full of broken links, things missing, things not working. So essentially, I just kind of decided one day I've had enough of seeing mods on YouTube, but no one ever releasing anything and all that. And I thought, screw this, I'm going to make something myself, even if it sucks, just to see, for my own entertainment. So I basically like Googled really, really hard, scoured through these forums to find any information I could to document it, try and find any tools that would work on these old links. And yeah, that's kind of where I started, to be honest with you. I haven't been around the scene as long as Colin has, but the difference now to when I started in 2019 is night and day. The scene has exploded since then. It's great to see.
Love that this is like a story of an aspirant mage going through the arcane text to see what spells work. That's kind of charming. It's a very formative story. I can see why this is probably going a little bit too cart before the horse, but like Aydan's working on that project that you see on the Twitter with the Godot engine stuff, making it probably a lot more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we have to remember that when we talk about modding the classic games, there's games that have been around a long time, but also, as you guys have just mentioned, like the forums and stuff, all the discoveries that people made to make it easier. Feels like, from an outside perspective, feels like a checkerboard sort of history, trying to figure out what was where and when was what, and trying to put it back together, because that is the case with internet growth over the last 20 years. You know, it's the same with everything, with, you know, video games and just everything, where it was all forums and they just died off. And those forums, many of them are completely gone, scrubbed from the internet. And the ones that do exist, graveyard is a great word, absolutely, like probably full of bots and adverts and stuff now, on top of the fact that nothing actually functions because it's not being cared for anymore because everyone's moved on. We've talked about it before on the show, you know, it used to be the case where people will make fan sites and that kind of thing. It doesn't exist anymore. People make Facebook pages for their fan sites instead and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to have both kind of, yeah, the early perspective and someone who's been here for a long time and someone who came in late and, yeah, has also seen the community blow up, because modding means a lot of different things. We're talking probably going to talk a lot about the classic games in this podcast because that's what you guys are very much au fait with. But, you know, modding in general across video games with modern video games is very, very, very popular from all walks and possibilities of things that you would want to do with the game, gameplay tweaks and skins and all kinds of stuff. There are entire websites dedicated to chronicling mods for people just to go and browse and download, of course. And I'm sure that's really nice that exists now. So it's good that Resident Evil modding is in a healthier space than it has been for some time. But I imagine it ties into, you know, the wider perception of mods and the wider usage of mods and acceptance of mods by people that just want to mod whatever game they're potentially playing. Let's go and look this up and see what's out there for this, including modern Resident Evil games and including classic Resident Evil games as well. Steve, what's your experience with this kind of thing? I just wanted to ask you about this because we talked about it a little bit before, and as I said at the top, neither of us had a huge amount of experience, to my knowledge, with playing fan games of classic games. Both of us have played a little bit of the Biorand randomizer recently anyway, for the classic games. But what's your experience with Resident Evil modding? Do you remember seeing it for the first time online? Speaking of fan sites?
Yeah, it was... what was it? Mortal Knight's fairly recent, isn't it? It was...
Recent-ish, yeah.
Yeah, 1.5, the early build, obviously that was through First Aid Spray. I mean, in some certain lenses, you could argue that's somewhere between a mod and a fan game as much as it is a resurrection of the material. Kendo's mod, Barry's mod. Wait, Barry's mod's out, right? I'm not going crazy. I'm not being senile. Yeah, I know, I've played that.
I was waiting for Aydan, who makes Barry's mod, to answer that question.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm a natural blonde, can you tell?
I was going to say that was like my first ever mod, so that was literally like one of the first things I ever made.
Nice. It's cool because it's one of those ones that you see all the time, like cropping up. Like it's a popular thing for like streamers and Let's Players to play like a blast through a Barry's mod. If you look it up, you can see a bunch of Resident Evil heads, many of which have been on the show, who have played through it and stuff like that. So that's cool.
The oddest fan game I think I've played is Code Madman, but that's like built out of 3.5. The idea of 3.5. I know that's outside the purview of RE1, 2, and 3. But That's the one that jumps out as like, because it's you can tell it's a lot more experimental in that. I'm not even sure if it's even using RE4's engine. It's peculiar.
Yeah. Yes, I know exactly the one you're talking about. And that's the wonderful thing about it, is like you get that, as I said, all the way down from this is incredibly odd, how did you even do this, to no, do you know, I simply want to swap what this character looks like, or tweak this so that it functions probably how it should. Minor gameplay stuff. And I remember seeing it all about the internet for a long time, and not... I guess I did understand it. I knew what it was. I knew fans had made it work. But if I ever looked it up, I'm sure I bounced right off and be like, I don't understand what I'm looking at here at all. Nowadays, this is the kind of thing that I would potentially just screw around with, probably not get particularly very far, but just for the fun of it, just to crack that open and have a look at the insides and be like, what happens if I put it here? And I've done a little bit of that with video games in general, just like the most minor of stuff where you can open a character skin in an editor and be like, oh, I can just change this and save the file, and now it's mapped this texture over the model, and oh look, now they've got battle scars, or that kind of stuff, simple stuff. I think, Steve, you and I have talked about before how with Resident Evil 1 PC, you can, and just some games in general, you can just swap out some of the audio files. So I think we joked at one point that
just redub it.
Yeah, first Aid Spray gets to a certain number of followers or whatever, and we'll redub Resident Evil 1 or have Steve make all the weapon sounds or whatever. That kind of dumb stuff that's just for us. And that's the beauty of it, that to a certain extent, obviously it depends how deep you want to go with it, and making like a full conversion mod or recreating entire locations, that's going to take some serious dedication. But there's also I just want to tinker with this for something that'll make me happy or make me laugh. But that's as deep as I ever got with it. In that vein, then, let's talk about you guys and your proudest Resident Evil fan game projects. So if you want to run through some of the stuff that you've made that people might know you for, and then highlight the one that you're the most proud of. Colin, let's go through your resume, as I said. What might people know you for, and what are you the most happy with?
Well, people probably know me from Distant Memories, because that was the first ever full conversion mod I actually started working on. And that was a 3-year project that we worked on, and then unfortunately we ended up scrapping it. There was all kinds of issues surrounding that I'm not going to go into detail about, because you can just check it up on the internet, it's all there. Yeah, that was a good one, because that was when we were experimenting with like finally getting custom angles in a room, understanding how the data worked, how scripting worked. And then obviously the tools were getting developed alongside that, and we were trying to figure out ways of like obviously putting this into public domain so people could understand how the data structures worked. And we did it. We managed to nail it. My friend Mortician would probably say on this that he was tearing his hair out, wanting to kill me by the end of it, because he was having to learn Python script for Maya and Python script for Blender, and he hated Maya so much by the end of it. But the one thing that I did carry on doing with those tools that he actually gave me was obviously the Resident Evil 3 Revisited project, which I finished last year, over 6 years of working on it, which was rebuilding every single room in Resident Evil 3 OG from the very beginning to the very end.
You shared a lot of that on the server, I remember, as well, as you going through it and being like, look at the latest rooms I've done. It was all very cool to look at, and very weird as well to see all the different layers going on.
There's been a lot of stress over that project, and there's nothing but respect for Colin, because I know that they had like some aggro near the end of it. Not their fault, of course, but people stealing credit. We'll leave it there, but
Yeah, that really did end up winding me up a lot in the end, but that's just the way it goes, unfortunately, when you put stuff in public domain.
In that case, Aydan, let's go through some of the stuff that people might know you for. As we said, Barry's mod, but there's a whole slew of stuff out there right now. And what one would you say you're the most proud of?
Yeah, I've done loads of stuff. Barry's mod, Ada's mod. I've done like Wesker's Escape mod. I've done Marvin mod, loads of stuff. The thing I'm probably most proud of is definitely going to be Resident Evil Containment, because like that is literally like it's not just a total conversion as such, but like there's so much new content. There's brand new areas, new cutscenes, FMVs, original music. Like we're literally pushing the RE1 engine to its absolute limits with what it can do in many ways. So definitely that project.
That's a good point, actually, because I wanted to, I guess, ask a question which might seem kind of silly, and there might not actually be an answer for it. But obviously, yeah, like, where's the line between what you, and it might be down to a personal thing, but the difference between a mod and a fan game for you? Because when you look at something like, we talk about Distant Memories, but Containment in being a great example right now, that's a fan game from, my perspective, because it's got all new characters or characters. Is Trent, the character from the book? Is that what is that what that's meant to be, or is it just a great name? You picked out a great name that happens to match up with a low-key goated Resident Evil character, but also new areas, new music, as you said, cutscenes. It's like a brand new experience. It's not like a Barry's mod where it's like, hey, these are familiar locations, but seen from a perspective of a different character. For you, where is the line, if there is one?
Okay, so just to answer some of the other questions, Trent is indeed the Trent from the book.
Good.
He's sort of like a little cameo in Containment, but basically because Containment and my friend Elric, who's making Resident Evil Revisited, the mods are kind of gonna have like little nods to each other, so that's how I've got them in.
Cool.
In regards to the difference, for me, a mod is obviously when you're modifying a pre-existing game. So in this instance, we're modifying Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, 3, and so on and so forth. I understand your logic with a fan game, because some of these mods are so in-depth and complete total conversions. I get the logic of a fan game, but I think for me a fan game is if you're making a game in its own engine, and a mod is if you're modifying an existing game engine on the technical level, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
One's putting a painting up in a building, one's building the scaffolding of the building all in itself.
Yeah, I hope that makes sense. It's kind of like...
totally.
It's kind of like, imagine you have a painting that doesn't have any color. Well, I'm adding color to it. That's a modification versus you drawing something brand new, being the fan game. So
that makes sense, because it doesn't matter from your perspective, like how much you change, you are still using the bare bones of what's there. No matter how much you change, it is still a mod it is based on a specific game rather than built from the ground up. I completely understand that. Colin, do you come down on the same side of it? Is your definition similar?
Well, in regards to doing mods, no, in regards to like doing like fan mods and stuff in the older engines, obviously we can call that a total conversion in the sense that we are changing the environments, we're changing cutscenes and everything else. Whereas when you see stuff that do like fan games where they just take assets, they dump it in and say, oh, this is a fan game, it's like, well, it's not technically a fan game because you're not using like the simplicity that we had back then. You're just trying to bring it into a much more modern engine with more stuff to add on to make it look more polished, make it look even better. But then that's defeating the purpose of like being a fan game in terms of being a mod, which was obviously simplistic. You're restricted to what you've got, and that's what makes the creativity come out more than if you can just go shove it all in Unreal 5 and say you've done something with it.
I've got chest pains all of a sudden. Why? No. I mean, it's like comparing... Yeah, like Colin said, and then the Seamless HD project, which is basically a mod. It's an aesthetic reskin. But, I mean, there is still a lot of work done in, everything's redrawn. As opposed to literally just dumping Resident Evil 1, 4, 5 models into a pre-scaffolded made UE5 map. Maybe put a bit of grass in there, Sonic in a field, and calling it a day. It's not... Nintendo, hire this man, that kind of logic. It's not as fun, not as well thought out, not as passionate.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, by asking this question, as someone who has admitted I don't know enough about this kind of thing, it's not in any way am I trying to like downplay the difference or say that mods are lesser or anything like that. I'm just wondering where, what the sort of separate definition is for you guys who are entrenched with it, who know, who work in this space. Speaking of working in the space, though, you talked about your history and the stuff that you have made. What have you got going on right now? I know you're both hard at work on various things. Aydan, what's in the pipeline for you at the moment?
Okay, so right now I'm working on the Resident Evil Survivor Redux project, which, if none of you have seen before, basically I'm taking the original Resident Evil Survivor game on PlayStation and making it into a third-person classic RE experience. It's also being expanded, so it's not just like a run and gun. There's going to be puzzles, different routes, backtracking, and that kind of thing. So that's what's going on in the mod space. And on the side of that as well, I'm of course developing my own Resident Evil clone engine in Godot. I don't know if I can call it an engine because it's in another engine, but it's like it's a template, a framework, if you will, with the intent to obviously make, in this instance, better fan games. See the difference now between mods and fan games, like?
Yeah.
But with my engine, I can import like higher polygon models, have better lighting effects, but still create interesting stories and blah 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 to create fan games. And I also want to use it to make something original, perhaps one day even commercial. Not on a grand scale, of course, just on a low level indie scale.
That's really cool. Obviously, both really really exciting stuff. That you talked about on social media. There's a little, I guess, tech demo. Is that appropriate for the engine, just to see how it feels to move around in that, a limited space in there, just to see how we've got the basic stuffs down, which is really cool. I'm a big fan of the Survivor Redux thing, and I've played the demos as a big fan of Survivor in general. And when people kind of try to downplay that game, as people are wont to do, and I do see their perspective, I always argue with there's a lot to love about it in terms of the locations, the location variety, the pathing that it gives to you. So it's really exciting to hear you say, about sort of expanding that out as well. And also some of the story beats. My defense for it is also that, sure, the amnesia stuff and is kind of hokey, but the Tyrant Lab and the we're cutting up children stuff is some of the darkest things in Resident Evil history. So hopefully this gets Survivor in front of some new people or makes them rethink certain aspects of it. I'm really, really looking forward to that.
Let's just not forget that Ark Thompson hath the highest power level of all Resident Evil protagonists.
That's
taking
true.
on 5 to 6 tyrants and just walking away casually. Some say he's still flying that helicopter to this day.
I was going to say, also he fires a rocket while on a helicopter at something hanging off the same helicopter. So, Ark's pretty cool.
He is the true Giga Chad of
He
classic
really
Ark.
is.
Yes, he is.
Please include in this game the ability to give him a giant chin, like a toggle for a giant Chad chin. I'd appreciate that.
That is doable.
Can you code in hidden outfits? That seems like a unlockable
Yeah,
thing.
of course.
Excellent. Colin, what are you working on at the moment? Because I know that is also very exciting.
So we're working on Project Starlight, which is the Resident Evil Gaiden remake. And so we're taking the Game Boy Color original and converting it from 8-bit into 32 with pre-rendered environments and puzzles also, whilst also making the plot coherent and actually fitting in with the game's lore.
Nice. that's a mountain.
I've got to ask, how are you going to do the combat? Like, is it going to be still turn-based, or is it going to be like traditional Resident Evil, aim R1, X, shoot?
It's traditional. We won't be doing the combat system, unfortunately, because let's face it, that was the only thing that made Gaiden really goddamn bad to play.
I mean, it reminds me of Undertale's combat, but that's just me.
I get that.
So it also means when we're building it, we've also access to the other side of the ship, so you're not just going to be getting the side you see on the Game Boy Color, you're going to be getting the other side too, so there's going to be a lot of new stuff in there that's never been done before.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's really cool that you're both working on new perspectives of maligned Resident Evil games, I guess is probably the right word for it. And for the record, I think that the combat system in Resident Evil Gaiden was kind of charming in its own kind of way for the time, for the system that they had and the limitations they had. But again, like Survivor, it will be cool to see this approach from a mainstream classic Resident Evil approach with, classic aiming and firing system that Steve has mentioned and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, really, really excited about this, as ranging from kind of tongue-in-cheek about it, but also genuinely waving the flag for Gaiden sometimes. Really, really excited about that kind of stuff.
It's the music that's kind of like drawing me in right now. Are you going to go with like the classic score, or are you going to be modifying or remixing your own, or is that?
I think it's going to be a bit of both, because the funny thing is, with some of us in the community, we kind of all dip into each other's projects. But I know, because like we started like working on Gaiden together, but obviously that's taken a bit of a back burner while we sort of work on other things. But I know that the original soundtrack is going to be in there remixed, obviously, not going to be 8-bit. I think we can expect some additional new music because I'm pretty sure the Game Boy only had like 4 or 5 tracks anyway.
I was just going to say, you probably
And
will
one of
have
them's the
to.
title call, let's be real.
Yeah,
You know.
you probably will have to. We've got a show. It's somewhat on hiatus right now. I'm going to peel back the curtain here. Called Now That's What I Call Survival Horror, where we rank the music from Resident Evil games. Someone picks their top 10 tracks from a game, and we talk about it. And we always said it'd be great to do a Gaiden episode, genuinely. But I mean, can you even get to 10 tracks with that soundtrack? It's a bit of a stretch. You might have to do a top 7 or something. Yeah. Here's a piece of music, and now here's the same piece of music, but it has percussion on top. So it's good, Aydan, that you mentioned about dipping into each other's projects and that kind of stuff, because that actually was going to be my next kind of question, is to talk more about the community side of it. And it sounds kind of like a healthy community, at least in some respects, and we have touched on maybe that's not always the case, and we'll get there. But there's enough people in there that you can all kind of look out for each other and assist each other and collab, which obviously I'm sure makes the experience A, more enjoyable, and B, probably in theory more fluid, more hands to turn the gears. But what about Resident Evil sort of lends itself so well to fan games, do you think? Because I'm sure there are franchises out there that have more mods and fan games, like Doom. I mean, it's kind of synonymous with it. But Resident Evil, at least it seems like right now, as you guys have mentioned, is in a healthy space. So, Aydan, what do you think about, Resident Evil and its appeal to modders and fan games?
I just think that the lore, at least for every game pre RE4, I won't get into that too much just yet. There's a lot of potential and unexplored lore that's there. I mean, I'm gonna have to go into it. As we know, with when they done RE4, they kind of wiped away all of the build up of what was happening with the original games. Like each character at the end was going, right, it's time to take down Umbrella. Right, we're finally going to take him down. This time Umbrella's gone too far, blah, blah, blah. It was all built into some huge conclusion where they were finally going to do something about it. And then it was kind of like just what washed away with lol stock crash, bro, which killed me. But you consider there's just so much lore, there's so many characters, there's so many unexplored opportunities, which is, even though my first mod, Barry's mod, is really, really basic and pretty crap compared to my later work because it was my first thing, I just think like people want to see like their side of the stories. Like if I worked on a Rebecca mod, there's things I can do there to where you see the game through her perspective. I just feel there's just a lot of untapped potential and locations, lore, and there's just so much that can be done. And I think there is a bit of a split in the fandom, especially for older fans like myself and Colin. Don't want to speak for you too, but like we just missed that sort of universe pre RE4 where everything just went a bit global and a bit crazy too quickly, if you know what I'm saying. Like you look at the jump from 4 to 5 to 6, it's quite staggering versus how more isolated and more unique and the first 2 games felt, if that makes sense. And I hope I'm articulating well.
Yeah,
more intimate scale, and a more coherent a plot, and less, oh my god, the entire world is doomed if this doesn't get done.
Yeah,
in a weird way.
Yeah, no, I think, it's fair to say that we are, Steve always said, or once said, and I have repeated ad nauseum because it's a great word, but omnivorous of Resident Evil. Like, we will sort of dip into all of it. But both massive soft spots for the original games and, what they did. And as you guys said, sort of the theming of it and the feel of it, the isolated nature. And throughout the years, even though we enjoy the new games, every now and then you're going to bang on and be like, it'd be nice to have one smaller budget, sort of low-key experience, fixed camera angles, put in a character like a Rebecca or somebody that could potentially be in peril again, in an isolated experience, as a nod to the originals. It's a shame that style died out. But yes, of course, the storyline is a thing that I guess we can never get back to, because once Resident Evil 4 did what it did, yeah, it is what it is now. So it's nice that provides an opportunity for fan gamers, modders, and that community to explore that part of Resident Evil. Because Capcom, obviously, they have to, I'm sure everyone understands that they made that decision, and now they kind of have to live with it, and they have to kind of move on from it, as it were. Whereas fan gamers, you could almost kind of ignore that sort of stuff and just be like, you know what, I'm going to build out what happened afterwards in this timeline of events. Let's ignore Resident Evil 4, let's set a game afterwards. Or as Aydan, as you've said, I'm going to retell this story from a different perspective, which you've done several times over with Marvin's mod, Barry's mod, and so on, which is really popular because one thing that I think about Resident Evil compared to some other games is for the better, I think, sometimes, and we love to speculate about things like Marvin and what he got up to between Resident Evil 2, 3 and Outbreak, and characters like that. You know, Resident Evil 1 famously doesn't have a canon sort of choice of character. It's some combination of those playthroughs that we never see that takes place. It's for the best in a way that is the case, but because it's fan games and mods, you're allowed, people can be like, here's my spin on it. And it done. People don't have to take it super seriously and complain about canonicity and that because, hey, this is what I would do if it was me. So we kind of get to have our cake and eat it too in that way. Because sometimes mystery is best, but also sometimes I want to play as Barry Burton in Resident Evil 1, for example, and see that side of the story. Colin, how do you feel about, what it is about Resident Evil that stands out to people when it comes to mods and fan games?
Well, for once, the original games weren't directed by Michael Bay like the 6th game went and did. The original games hold at this piece because there is so much lore they had in there, and the backgrounds also told a story. I know I've mentioned this when I've done my own streams. Raccoon City is the main character. It tells its own story of the dead. It tells its own story of the survivors trying to escape. Capcom only did that with Outbreak. They only did it with Resident Evil 2 and 3, but they never expanded on that, which is a shame. So we can do that as modders because we can tell our own stories within it. And recently I just read a transcript of the audio dramas that they all ever released in Japan. And there's all this story that, we as modders could actually implement, put new locations in, and we can actually tell those stories. We just never got them in English.
That's
really
really cool.
Biohazard the stage. Can you imagine someone turning that into a university campus or something?
That would be great. And to your point, that's exactly what you're saying when you guys are both working on converting sort of, as I said, maligned Resident Evil games and bringing them up scale. It's like taking an underrated part of the story or whatever and reappraising it. You could absolutely do that with, the Ada Spy audio drama or the Sherry one or whatever. That would be really cool way to bring those things to life that most people aren't aware of, or at least if they are aware of it, like myself, I don't really know anything about them. I just know that they exist. And now, reading the file Reporter's Diary from Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Rexy, who you can follow on Twitter @RexToSeeWrites.
At last, I have found the evidence I need to prove that a cannibal disease is indeed happening in the city. One man actually ate people to death. He was like a savage animal chewing away on your flesh. It was completely disgusting. I have heard rumors that many people are also suffering from this disease now. However, the causes of the disease is not yet known. Is this another mystery of the present disease? I'll have to check on it. They have placed Raccoon City under martial law because of the cannibal disease. I have lost contact with the media outside of the city, but I won't give up. As a journalist, I won't keep my eyes shut and walk away. I have a duty to the people and to my profession. I don't think the disease has spread nationwide yet, and I believe the city holds the key to its creation and cure. In fact, I'm sure of it. The military has set up blockades around the city to keep people from escaping and spreading the disease. Most of the citizens have either died or come in contact with the disease. I know that it is the right decision to quarantine the city, but I can't help but pity myself. If I'm infected or eaten, it doesn't matter. My fate is already sealed. All I have left is my journalism. I won't give up until I solve the mystery of this deadly disease. I have just discovered that the disease is not spread through the air, but by some other means.
Speaking of not knowing things, as an expert on it, what do you think people don't know about the process of modding or fan gaming? What do you think people's assumptions are that are incorrect, Aydan?
Oh, good lord. Okay.
Can of worms.
It's just gonna, this is. I don't think people quite appreciate just how time-consuming it is to do simple things. So, for example, let's just go Colin makes a background. Okay, so let's just say he spends, I don't know, a week building one single simple little room, texturing it, lighting it, rendering it. So there's a week's worth of time there. Then of course, yes, we get the images and we import them into the game. That only takes a few minutes because they're literally just bitmaps converted into TIM files, which are just PlayStation image formats. Okay, that's great. Then the next thing, depending on the tool, is that you have to build that room by hand. So in my case, I have to open up a tool. I have to create manual collisions, so for example, for walls and objects that the character can't walk through. So I have to set that up. Then I have to set up the camera and manually adjust that so it matches the background. So for example, I'll add a collision, say 4 walls in the room. I'll put the camera somewhere. I will then save it, load it into the game, and see where Leon is positioned against it. So the camera might be way off. Then I have to reopen the tool, adjust it again, say twist the camera on its axis a bit, save, reload the room, and see how tall Leon is against the wall again, and if it matches. Okay, great. I've got that camera angle done. Then I have to add a switch zone that then when the character walks into it, it swaps to another camera. But then it's the same process again of having to move that camera, adjust the axis, make sure it matches, and so on and so forth. Now, that one single room could have 6 camera angles, meaning you have to do that 6 times. So I do live streams on my YouTube channel where I'm creating rooms for Survivor Redux Live, and I think one good thing about it is it shows people just how it can be tedious. I enjoy it because I'm weird, but what I mean is I think people can see and appreciate just how long it takes to do even the most simple things, because I could spend 2 hours building a room that someone will run through in 20 seconds,
A wonderful example. As someone who does amateur Doom modding in a spare time, and that's way easier. Just slap a room, grid, Doom builder, bang, done. This is like a whole other level of stress, and that you haven't even added enemies, you haven't even had doors or items or any of the fun gimmicky stuff, interactable objects. That's just getting a room you can have Leon walk through.
Exactly, I was just going to say, so that in itself is just setting up, say, the collisions, the backgrounds, the cameras, blah, blah, blah. Then comes the scripting side of things, where then, of course, you have to script in the doors, items, and it's not just a case of adding a line of code for an item. Yes, you need to interact with it. But then, if you want a 3D model of that item to appear in the room, you then need to extract the 3D model and texture from another room file that has it, say, a first aid spray, and then import it into your room file, which then means you need to open up the room file's project file and mark inside of it that yes, there's a model and yes, there's a texture, just to get that to happen. Then of course, if you want cutscenes and events and other things, messages when you interact, enemies, the list goes on, guys. And then on top of that, I'm so sorry to ramble you, but
No,
it's beautiful, it's wonderful.
Yeah, but it's again, in other modern engines and other things like that, enemy sounds would load automatically. But with these games, for example, Footsteps, you need to edit the sound files of the room. So then you need to implement the correct footstep sounds or the correct enemy sounds. It's a hell of a lot of work. And I'm hoping my explanation and my waffling here emphasizes to people the misconception of why mods, at least total conversion mods, take as long as they do. Because, my lord, it's a lot of work. I haven't even got into the 3D modeling side yet, which Colin can take over for.
To your point, up to a certain point, I completely understood that. I've seen that you guys both do that kind of thing where you stream and it takes, hours and hours and hours just in one location, up to a week or whatever, maybe more. I didn't know that, in the classic games, that the footsteps had to be mapped. That makes sense. It's not necessarily that I didn't know. I hadn't considered that. It's that's an aspect as well that you have to consider. All these tiny little details in order to bring that atmosphere to life. But as you said, in theory, most people potentially are just going to breeze right past. But it does come together in the end, I guess, to create something that you're happy with, most importantly, I guess. But yes, Colin, please carry on. What do you think people don't know about the process and also 3D modelling?
To assume that when you first build an actual room without actual ways of importing the data, that the exact room is being used, but actually that's not the truth. That's what happened with DM quite a lot. So we had a lot of people posting, "Oh, I recognise that room. That's the Stars hallway. That's the front of the RPD." And it's like, it's the front of the mansion. It's not the same room. And years later, actually, when we imported the data, the angles didn't even match, even though they do look like they do. But they didn't. So we got that capability to rebuild stuff, and people were wondering why is it all taking so long. It's like, because we're doing this, we're trying to figure out what the data does. We're trying to rebuild everything from the get-go. And doing 3D modelling, like I've been doing this for a very long time now. I've lost count of how many years I've been doing it, but it is double digits. And like I say, when I'm streaming stuff, so when we're doing it as streams, and I'm actually showing people and I'm explaining to them, this is how we do it. I can import the data. I can then rebuild the data. I can then build the data up from the ground up. I refreeze stuff, having to rebuild all that from the ground up. Having instances where cameras would not match and having to manually rebuild everything from the ground up so that they did match. And a lot of people just think, oh, it's easy. You can just do it like that. And it's like, no, it takes years of practice, lots of coffee, lots of concentration. And it also falls hand in hand with modding as well. Because you can look at the data, you can look at how old it is, and then people will be like, well, I can read this in hex code, and then people will be like, well, I can read this in C code. It's like, well, it doesn't matter which one you're reading it is, you can still understand what stuff is. But if you try to say to somebody in your day and age, right, let's try and figure out what a door trigger is in hex code, you look at you as if you're talking a different language, and will then run a mile and not come back onto the Discord or the forum, because it's like, what the hell is this? What is the code for doing a door? What's the code for doing an item trigger? And it's only if you break it down now with having the ability to disassemble a file into this original C code that you can read and think, oh, that's what that's doing. That's what that event's doing. That's what's making the bars come up to do cutscene. That's disabling the player input. There's a lot of stuff that has to be done, and people just think you just press one button, it does it all. And it's like the case of, we're not here yet with AI. AI will never be able to do half the stuff we do, so stop trying to think of it as an idea. Go and learn how to do it like we had to.
Yeah, I imagine there are a lot of people that come in with a top-down great idea, but don't actually know the first thing about the basics of actually getting in there and, as you say, understanding the game's language.
The guys have got this really great new idea about Resident Evil now.
It does happen a lot. And to expand on what Colin was saying, because Resident Evil 2 has been pretty much ripped almost wide open in terms of getting its script in and done and understanding its textures and models and assets and things. But I worked in RE1 and I had to literally reverse a lot of the scripting myself, literally just by the process of elimination, and it was all done in hex. These days now, when I open up a script file in hex editor, I can actually read it almost like a second language. It's crazy.
Is that cool? Do you feel cool about that, or is that oh no, I've spent too much time doing it? Is that
no, that is cool.
That weird? I mean, I'm not saying one way or the other, but I've had those things where it's I've clearly put too much time into this, but I'm happy with it myself. But it's Jesus, how do we get to this point?
Well, I mean, it's I guess it's kind of cool in one way, but I wouldn't exactly go around bragging about going, yo, bro, RE1 hex code,
I love that.
Maybe I'm bigging it up a bit too much, but it sounds like you're learning the runes. You can I know exactly how to tweak this, and picking out the entire skeleton of the game, and then going, right, if I change this here, that means then that this could do this, or this can now do this, or this won't do this, and that just sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah, the process of discovery when I was doing it was a lot of fun, because it's you'd have a lot of frustration going, oh god damn it, why isn't this working, and failures. But then when you get it, that breakthrough, and you finally isolate the code and then you test it and it works, it's like the heavens open and you get that huge serotonin boost,
And say, it's when you mentioned that they basically cracked the genome of RE2, they can that's a question I wanted to ask, which was that of the original trilogy, what was the easiest and most malleable to build with?
Resident Evil 2, hands down, because that's the one that has the most tools, the most support, and again, most people have spent the last 20 years or so dissecting to every degree.
Well, but so is 3's dodging and stuff? Is that, I'm assuming that's something that people could hack back into, or is it's not a simple cut and paste job? I imagine that.
Okay, so in theory, anything is possible, again, in theory, you could implement it in a way. There is, someone did put a little animation hack in for a character where when you press backwards. When an enemy's close, you kind of dash backwards. You sort of jump backwards away from the enemy. So obviously, I suppose if you mix that animation with perhaps like an input command, it is doable, but it's not as easy as copying and pasting and things like that. Again, it's, these aren't open source engines. It's not like you can just open the engine and just reprogram everything quickly. These are closed source, so we're literally hacking away tiny bits and pieces and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the monsters in Resident Evil 2, for example, wouldn't have had a dodge zone or whatever you would call it, the thing that collides with Jill's animation to make it so Jill does an evade. So you'd have to figure out how to set that in.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing like that. I mean, again, if you wanted it to mimic RE3, sorry, you're talking about literally implementing brand new code, brand new runtimes, routines, and it's again, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's unlikely to be done without having like a decompiled version of the game that we can easily edit and recompile.
Interesting. To that end, actually, you kind of made me think, like, has making, modding and this kind of thing changed your perspective when you sit down and play the games? I'm not going to go necessarily as far as, like, do you get less enjoyment from sitting down and playing the games? Although, maybe that's true, but is it hard for you to turn parts of your brain off now when you play a game from this era, whether it's a game that you know really well, like a Resident Evil, or maybe you sit down and play another survival horror game or a game very similar from the era that you don't know as well? Does it sort of fire off synapses in your brain of, this is potentially how they did that, or this is potentially what I could do with that? Colin, how has modding kind of affected how you view video games?
Well, my background's in games design because I got a degree in games design because that's what I studied in uni. So it always was going to change from that point onwards. So over the years, obviously modding stuff and actually writing games myself and doing stuff in Unreal and everything else and VR on top of everything, it hasn't really changed my perception. It's made me interested in how we could view stuff in VR from old games. I'd love to do some PS1 porting into VR to walk around that.
Yeah.
But no, when I'm playing the games, I'm playing the old Resident Evil games, yes, fair enough, I'll sit there and I'll go, I know how this is all built, I know how the script's working, I know where the door triggers are, I know where all these items are, now the enemies are going to come at me, but I still enjoy it because those games were just done so well back then compared to what they are nowadays, where you can say, oh, that's predictable, that can be done with that, that's a cutscene trigger, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot more creativity in the older games, but I've been saying that for years when I've been playing them, compared to what we've got now, where you've got uncompressed games which are about 200 gigs plus, and it's just like, where did the creativity go? Exactly.
I'm impressed that knowing how well the sausage is made has not changed its taste, for want of a poor metaphor.
No, that's a great metaphor.
Aydan, how do you feel about your relationship with games now that you've gotten into modding over the last sort of 5 years or so? Does it change your perspective on older games at all in particular?
To be honest with you, not really. I mean, as Colin said, I appreciate, and I agree that older games definitely were more creative, but I think that comes from a place of them having to be because technical limitations and things. Limitations breed creativity. I found that with modding, there are people like Resident Evil Nemesis who made Mortal Knight and was leading during the storm. The things that guy can do are out of this world. But from my experience working with RE1 when I was reversing it and finding all the limitations, it just made me think outside the box and things, and I think that's what developers had to do back then. But in terms of how I view games since modding, not much has changed. I still play the original Resident Evil games and I love them exactly the way they are. I do sometimes think, oh wow, they could have done this and this and really expanded this, but I understand that back then, we have to take into consideration it was a new era in 3D. It was brand new to them. They were sort of learning as they went as well, and they had a specific vision of what they wanted to do and so on. But I guess the TLDR is, no, it hasn't really changed my appreciation or how I view them as such.
Good. Nice. Okay, so sort of round this out a little bit, let's just talk about the fan game community. You guys have talked about, at the beginning, Aydan in particular, you pointed out how it went through a weird period, but it seems to be on the up and up for potentially various reasons. What's the Resident Evil modding community like these days? Is it particularly, you guys have talked about collabing on projects together. Is it tightly knit at all? Aydan, how do you feel about it right now? Where's the health of it at?
It's definitely healthier than it ever has been. The information is out there, the tools are freely available and things like that. The only thing I would say is that for a lot of people, Colin kind of brushed on it earlier, is that people sort of come in expecting, oh great, right, I want to learn how to mod, I want to do this, and I'm like, yeah, you can do it, but there's a lot of time investment. It's not as easy as, right, we tell you this and you can go and do it. There is an element of sort of what's the word I'm looking for? You know, you have to put the time in yourself. You need your own drive, and you have to put time into it, or you're going to get nothing out of it. Because asking people a million questions on how to do everything in depth is, when they are busy with their own developments or their own, you know, real life responsibilities, it's not quite that level. But it is a lot healthier than it ever has been. There is help out there. You know, I've done tutorials and people DM me all the time asking me for help, and I'm always available to push people in the right direction. But it's a lot better than it was, put it that way. It's the only thing I would say is that it's still in its infancy, again, because people are so busy with these massive projects at the minute. They don't have the time to be able to write up full-on in-depth tutorials, and I just want to make people realize that it's not gatekeeping or anything. If people want help and they are eager to learn, I myself, I'm more than happy to push you in the right direction, but you have to invest some time, because the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. There's no one button does all. It is a process to learn, you know.
Yeah, and hopefully you guys, what you said earlier, both of you, about how long it takes, kind of says that if you want this, you're going to have to really want it, and it's going to be worth it when you get there. But it is a huge time investment and a huge effort investment. So trying to take the easy route, if you like, isn't really the way to do it, because it requires such an immense amount of energy. Colin, how do you feel about the community at the moment?
Well, I'm going to throw this in as well. Like, when we talk about how creative it was back in the old days, when you've actually used some of the tools they actually use, because I think it was a couple of years ago, I actually delved into Softimage 3D, which is the program that Capcom used to build the backgrounds with. And the amount of nightmares I had trying to get stuff imported, to get the UV mapping to work correctly, and then read one of the old manuals from back in the 90s where it says, UV mapping doesn't exist for hard-edge polygonical models, only works with NURBS. So then I started thinking, so how the hell did they UV map these models for these characters for video games back then if they had no UV mapping like we got nowadays? So, do I think the community is getting better? Yes, because we've got the tools now that we didn't have back then. So a lot more creativity is coming out of it. But then again, we still have people that do hoard information. We do have people that will suppress that information, which winds me up, which is when I have to then throw the information out myself, or whoever else can see that. Project-wise, yeah, people are busy with like a million projects in one, because obviously I'm busy with stuff, and another load of stuff will get thrown on top of that. I have had people pester me about certain projects, converting like a 2,000 plus polygonical model into a Resident Evil 2 character model, and then about 2 days later after looking into it, they're asking me, have I done it yet? And I'm like, I've not even started, because it is too many polygons for the engine to take. I have to downgrade it. I've got to rebuild it all. So, again, a lot of people just think you can do it like that, but it can't. You have to, like, prepare it. You've got to downgrade it for some of it. And then other things, you've just got to go back and, like, reprogram your brain to be just like a Capcom developer back in the 90s with very restrictive tech. And a lot of people don't get that. People just think you can go, right, I'm going to take this 60,000 polygon model with all this hair and everything, and I'm going to stick it in the RE2 engine, it's going to work. No. It'll work in the remake where everybody's modding characters in, but it will not work in the older one. It all has to be completely downgraded to at least 700 polygons. And then they're like, oh, that's not good enough. The quality's not good enough. It's all crappy graphics. And you're just like, go then. There are graphics. We love them. Go away.
Seems like a weird thing to propose, because yes, it's a game from 1998. What do you expect? Like, do you not understand what you're actually asking? That's very
just
strange.
Picturing someone rock up to Colin's door with, hey, here's Aloy, can you put this in, please?
Dante from DMC5, please. In you go.
The thing is, to expand upon like what Colin was saying, like I said, there's a lot of people who think that you can just kind of come in and the tools are at the point where you just click a button and bump, but it doesn't work like that. You need to learn the scripting language, whether you do it in hex or do it in C script with the bioscript tool. You need to understand that the room data is it's like an archive, like a zip file. So imagine a zip file, and inside that zip file you have the scripts for the room, the collisions, the cameras, sounds, and all that. It's understanding how to edit those and why you need to repackage them. There's a lot. Again, there's a reason why it's not a simple process to be like, hey guys, here's my 2-minute tutorial how to do this, because it's not that fast. As I hope I emphasized earlier, when building the rooms, scripting them is just as long and just as tedious a process. We're dealing with an engine that's, again, it's not open source, it's closed source. It's from 1998, so all the it was programmed on a PlayStation, ported to PC, but it wasn't ported to PC hardware. It's still emulating a lot of the way the PlayStation works, just in PC code, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So we're still stuck in all these restrictions. But again, as Colin said, people come over thinking you can just do this, and it's like, no, it's really not. Unfortunately, Resident Evil modding is still very much in its infancy. It's not like Doom and Wolfenstein where it's been open source and it's had all these upgrades. We have all these modern tools. Nope, none of that.
Interesting.
I mean, would you even argue there's in Quake and Doom's case, there's obviously fan engines and things. And and obviously we've talked about Aydan's experimentations and building in Godot, but are there any other fan engines that you could think of that are trying to do survival horror games of Resident Evil's kind of shape?
Oh, see, I know, I know someone's trying to, have you seen these decompilation projects out there where people have reverse engineered Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask and other things? I know there's a project out there where someone is in the process of trying to decompile RE2. Now, if that is done, that will open up the world of modding to unbelievable levels, because as you asked earlier, at that point we can implement brand new features and things. We can remove these poly limits and add modern functionality. So instead of needing to make a bloody TIM image, you can just throw a PNG in there or whatnot. I'm not really aware of any sort of random classic survival horror engines. Like mine isn't. Mine's not emulating. I'm copying RE, but it's not using any of the same code or framework, if that makes sense. It's literally its own little entity that's just copying it.
Okay, yeah. As opposed to, it's not literally going to be Capcom's thing. It's Godot, and you're making Godot do things in the shape of it, not.
Yeah, it's not a source port into Godot. It's literally my own code. It just looks like and plays like RE, but it's got nothing to do with Capcom or their code.
Okay, so last question, to stand on a more positive note. We talked a lot about the stuff that you guys have made, but what are the fan games and mods from the Resident Evil community that other people have made that are your personal favourites? Any recommendations for people out there? Obviously, I highly recommend that you check out the work that both of you guys have done. Obviously, there'll be links in the description and that kind of stuff to go and follow them. But yeah, any other shout outs and stuff that you'd like to do from other people's projects from Resident Evil that you desperately love? Colin, what stands out to you?
The very first one I'll point out is Dark Biohazard, which never technically got released. That was pretty much what I'd say every modder pretty much looks at and says, this is why we wanted to mod in the first place, making a whole different story, which in its own self was an alternate one where, saying the Stars team never survived, they all died. Leon came to Raccoon, it was a whole different alternate story. Then unfortunately that got scrapped because unfortunately the hard drive that apparently had the data in it got completely fried and they lost everything. But that was a day for me. Is what inspired me to actually look into modding on the level that I can do it at now. But some of the fan games I've played, Aydan stuff I'll always throw in because I've played enough of those. Revisited obviously with Elric and Irinko because, again, I've played that. I know the guys, so I'd throw them in as well. Mortal Knight, I'd also throw in during the store when that gets released because that's looking pretty impressive. Another one I'll bring up is Resident Evil 2D Reborn on RPG Maker 2003 because that is actually a brilliant game for Resident Evil as a fan game that amazingly does the infantry system, and it's a 2D game, but it manages to fill in that little itch that a Resident Evil game has and has a good difficulty to it. But that's the only ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
Aydan, what about you?
To be honest with you, Colin kind of mentioned most of them. Yeah, so During the Storm, which at the minute is kind of cancelled / hiatus, but there were 2 demos released which are fantastic. Highly recommend playing those. Mortal Knight, again, as Colin said, is a fantastic one. There is the Resident Evil 1.5 project. As you explained earlier, it's kind of like, at this point, it is more of like a fan fiction than mirroring the original, but that's still really good. And the new backgrounds that Juvenile has been working on are absolutely fantastic. The 2D Reborn, the Resident Evil 2D Reborn that Colin mentioned, that was made in RPG Maker. If I remember, I think you play as a female like university student, Colin. Is that right?
You do, yeah.
Yeah, that I remember playing that back in the day, and I remember being like really immersed into it. It's a fantastic game. Highly recommend it, despite its like old SNES looking graphics. Gosh, I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, of course, Revisited, which has been worked on by Elric and Andrew, Enrico, and plenty of other people. That's going to be probably the biggest Resident Evil mod out there when it drops. It's insane. Obviously, well, of course, there's Project Starlight, which is a Gaiden remake, but that's kind of a slow burner. I think that's everything, really. Of course, there's My Things, I guess, which are, they're okay.
Humble man.
Yeah, well, they are. They're okay for what they are, I guess. I mean, I'm glad people like them.
Again, do check out everything that you guys have mentioned and their work. They've also shouted at each other, so we appreciate that. Links in the description for that. But nothing else remains for me but to thank our contributors, our patrons, and our listeners. Join the First Dates Break Discord server to become part of our community and hear the show early and unedited. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc. All of these links and all of our content can be found at faspraypod.com. You can listen to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and all good podcasting apps. And if you like what you hear, please do leave us a review where you can and spread the good word. Don't forget you can support the show by picking up some merch or at patreon.com/FASprayPod for as little as $1 a month. In our next episode, we finally return to where it all began and play the final fixed camera game in the series as we review Resident Evil 0. Thank you to the panel. You can follow all of the Puebo people individually. I'm at Signiac_123. Steve is at FB Steve Was Taken. Colin is at A Little Slice of 4. And Aydan is at Classic RE Mods. And finally, thank you for listening and have a good week.
I know I have to do it. It's a bad joke, but can we take Aidan's voice sample of just stock market lol and then make a Resident Evil fan game that is just the end of Umbrella and then it's just the audio file? April Fools, let's all get sad. Oh.